It feels as if Van Gogh was destined to be a failure. He was a psychological mess throughout his adulthood, only sold one painting in his lifetime, and died in relative obscurity. Yet today, he's one of the most famous artists of all time, but also one of the most tragic. One of the few things that would give Van Gogh a sliver of joy in his life was art. His proper actual art journey started relatively late. I mean, when he was a kid, his mother actually introduced him and the rest of his siblings to drawing and nature and stuff like that. But throughout his late teens and early 20s, he was kind of just all over the place, working as an art dealer for a little bit, as a teacher for a bit, even as a preacher. But none of these paths ended up panning out. And it was at the big age of 27 years old, where with literally nothing else going for him, Vincent van Gogh makes the life-altering decision to dedicate his entire existence to art. Now, out of the 5 siblings that he had, Vincent's brother Theo played by far the largest role in his life and his art, so much so that without Theo, Vincent van Gogh would probably have never become Vincent van Gogh. Now, in around 1880, Van Gogh joins an art academy where he's able to receive some official training and some technical proficiency, but this academic style of learning just wasn't it for him, and so after a few months he leaves the academy and moves over to The Hague, which is this city in the Netherlands at the time, which is kind of the place to be for an artist. And so here he meets and learns a bunch from other more experienced painters and starts painting a ton of still lifes, a ton of figures, a ton of portraits, a ton of landscapes, as well as making tons of drawings. And he begins to develop this sort of obsession towards art and painting, which is actually kind of perfect because one day Vincent and his brother Theo make a deal, and it's the kind of deal that 99% of artists who've ever lived could only ever dream of. So Theo would send Vincent money each month to kind of just cover living expenses and materials and stuff like that, and in return Vincent would just paint a lot and send the paintings over to Theo, and Theo could go on and sell them and make a profit. That was kind of the idea, since Theo was an art dealer by profession, so it worked out perfectly. So in 1885, Vincent sends the first painting over to Theo, and although today it's considered his first ever masterpiece, it absolutely flops when Theo tries to sell it. Nobody wants to buy it, because see, Theo was selling in Paris, and this gloomy, dark, dim art style didn't jive with Parisian art trends at the time, and so Vincent had no choice but to move to Paris and see what was up with their whole art trends situation. So when Vincent arrives at Paris, Theo introduces him to a bunch of impressionists, because impressionism at the time was a really big art movement that was kind of a counter to the status quo of painting at the time, which is centered around super realistic depictions of significant historical or religious events. And impressionism just wanted to come in and just focus on regular daily life instead of accurate depictions of subjects. It focused more on trying to capture the feeling of a subject. And so impressionist works have all these interesting colors and interesting lighting scenarios and stuff like that. And Van Gogh absolutely falls in love with this kind of art. He absolutely loves it and begins incorporating all these new brighter tones and colors into his own work. And there's actually a very clear visual difference between his paintings before moving to Paris and his paintings after moving to Paris. And so day by day, Van Gogh would just chill with all these impressionist guys, just talking about painting. They'd even model for each other to do portraits, since actually hiring models is way too expensive. So things were going great, but at some point people began getting sick of Van Gogh because he was so obsessive. All he wanted to do was talk about painting. One of the few guys though who was just as passionate about painting as Vincent was the artist Paul Gauguin, and so they just kind of hang out with each other at the bar over glasses of liquor, just talking about painting and stuff. It's kind of cool. Now, 2 years into his stay in Paris, Van Gogh kind of got sick of it. All the hustle and bustle and business of the city was kind of just too much for him. So he wanted to move out, especially since he'd been inspired a lot by Japan and Japanese art. He bought a bunch of prints and hung them up in his wall and stuff like that. And so in search of that Japan ambiance, Van Gogh decides to move to Arles, which is a village in the French countryside, since actually moving to Japan would have been just way too expensive. And so Van Gogh moves out to Arles in search of tranquility and inspiration. Little did he know how disastrously his spell in Arles was gonna end. So Vincent's time in Arles starts off great. He loves the serenity of the countryside where you could just paint in peace. He even had ambitions of starting a guild of painters where they'd all just kind of live together in the same house, just make art and be happy and everything would be lovely, which was obviously a dream that would never come true, not even close. Because at this point, Theo was still sending Vincent money. Their arrangement was still intact, despite the fact that he'd still been unable to sell any of Vincent's work. Regardless, whenever he'd send him money while he was in Arles, Vincent would just splurge most of of it on acquiring the highest quality paints, highest quality materials, and leave little for stuff like food. I mean, he was living on a diet of basically stuff like coffee, bread, and cigarettes, stuff like that. And who knows, perhaps these kinds of living conditions contributed to his eventual downward spiral, because Van Gogh kind of starts going crazy, like hallucinating, hearing voices in his head, which is all only amplified by the extreme loneliness that he was experiencing. So he asked Theo about this, who's somehow able to convince Paul Gauguin, the guy from before, to move over and keep Vincent company in Arles and just kind of like live with him for a little bit. So Gauguin joins Vincent in Arles, and even though things started off pretty good, their dynamic at some point began to spiral as well, with all these fights and arguments, until at some point Gauguin just had enough. He just couldn't handle this Van Gogh guy anymore, and so just a few months after moving in, he just leaves. And Vincent, who was terrified of going back into the pit of loneliness, is overcome with something and grabs a blade and follows Gauguin out. Gauguin in the street notices it, turns around, sees Vincent, sees the blade in his hand, and for a few moments the two men just kind of stare at each other, until after a bit Vincent just seems to kind of come to his senses and runs back into the house, where he just goes even insaner. So with the blade that he was gonna do something to Gauguin with, he cuts off his own ear, wraps it up, goes to a brothel, and gives it to one of the ladies there. Yeah. So he was obviously hospitalized for the injury, and after he got released, Vincent left Arles and returned home, where he agrees to be admitted into a mental asylum. So Theo gets him 2 rooms in the facility, one which would be his bedroom and one which would be more of his art studio. You know, he just wanted his brother to be nice and comfortable. And so during his time at the facility, Vincent's mental state would kind of just alternate between delirium, between calm, between madness and peace. And it's when he was at peace that he would make art. And interestingly enough, though, his time at the facility was actually the most productive period of his life. He ends up making over 150 paintings in the span of just a year, which initially is kind of surprising, because since Van Gogh was always a guy who preferred working from observation, but since he was restricted in this facility, his surroundings were limited, which meant that his sources of inspiration were limited, and so he had to kind of rely more and more on using his own imagination and creativity. And having to combine these two seemingly opposing approaches was probably one of the best things that could have happened to Van Gogh's art. One early morning before the sunrise, Van Gogh looked out of his bedroom window, and the stars in the sky seemed to have struck a chord within him. And so the next morning he went out to paint the sky as he remembered it. The painting ended up becoming The Starry Night, which is pretty much a priceless work of art today. So it's a sky that he'd observed, but he painted it in this uniquely expressive manner, as well as the fantastical looking cypress tree and the villages at the bottom was indicative of this approach of combining the reality that he saw with a little bit of abstraction, which is really cool. So during his time at this facility, Vincent finally, at long last, experienced one of the only artistic W's that he would actually live to experience. Because after all of these years, after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of paintings, Theo was finally able to sell one of his brother's pieces. It was the Red Vineyard, which sold for 400 francs at the time, which seems to be around $3,000-ish in today's money. It's pretty cool. So after a year in the asylum, Vincent got sick of it and he wanted to leave. So Theo got him a place to live, an inn, right next to a doctor who agrees to kind of keep an eye on Vincent. The doctor's name was Guichet, who Vincent did this portrait of, which would sell for over $80 million 100 years later. It was July 27th, 1890, and as nightfall approached, the innkeeper of the inn that Van Gogh was staying at began to get a bit worried, because Van Gogh had left the place earlier that morning and was yet to return. Fortunately though, at around maybe 8 or 9 p.m-ish, he returns. He just walks back in, clutching his stomach, and he walks up to his room. Since they were worried, the innkeepers go up and check on him, and there he reveals a gunshot wound to his abdomen. They immediately sent for the doctor, who arrives soon after and begins working on him. You see, earlier that day, Vincent had left the inn. He'd gone out into a wheat field with a revolver and shot himself. His exact reasons for doing this particular act on this particular day are kind of unclear. Anyway, the following morning, Theo arrives at the scene and he's able to find his brother gravely injured but still alive. When law enforcement came in to try and investigate what had happened, Vincent said to them very specifically, "Do not accuse anybody else it is I who wished to commit suicide. Now, there's all these theories going around about whether or not Vincent actually shot himself or whether it was someone else who shot him and he wanted to take the blame for it. Regardless, the guy had a gunshot wound to his abdomen and didn't have that much time left. And so he and Theo just kind of spend this time together, just talking and reminiscing of the good old days that they used to have together as kids. The doctor had been unable to get the bullet out and the wound was likely infected. And so later that night, at around about 2 a.m., Vincent van Gogh, by his brother's side, passes away. And 6 months later, Theo dies as well. They were buried right next to each other. And normally that would be the end of the story, but not this time. See, Theo had a wife, Joanna, who was always extremely supportive of both he and Vincent. And now with both of them gone, all she had left were just a few hundred Van Gogh paintings just lying around the house. So she made it her life's mission to make sure that one day the world would know the name Vincent van Gogh. She just knew that Theo didn't put all this faith into his brother for no reason, and so she catalogs all his work, as much of his work as she can find, and she began organizing all these exhibitions to show off Vincent's work. And at some point her efforts began to pay off, because in the following years and decades, Vincent's work began getting shown at gradually more and more prominent art exhibitions. She kept ownership of the paintings, but she sold a few of them to major and prominent museums, so that just year by year Vincent's legacy gradually began to grow and grow and grow, so much so that by the time she died in 1925, she'd been successful in her quest to make Vincent van Gogh a name that was famous across the global art world. And so it kind of just makes you wonder how many Van Goghs have just wilted away in the passage of time, forgotten forever, all because they didn't have a Joanna of their own. It's kind of crazy.